Welcome to Unrecorded Histories, your source for untold secrets, lost stories, and shocking facts. Subscribe now. The Vietnam War is remembered as one of the most painful and controversial wars in American history. For decades, school textbooks, official reports, and mainstream documentaries have told us the same story. America went to Vietnam to stop the spread of communism and to defend democracy in Southeast Asia. But behind this official narrative lies a web of hidden agendas, secret operations, government lies, and untold truths that were carefully kept from the soldiers who fought and from the American public. Hit subscribe and share as we ride through the hidden agenda of the Vietnam War the government never wanted you to know. When a young soldier boarded a plane to Vietnam in the 1960s, he carried with him the belief that he was fighting for freedom, for democracy, and to protect his country from the so-called Red Menace. But what he didn't know was that the war he was about to enter was not only unwinnable, but it was also a conflict fueled by political deception, economic interests, and deep state manipulation. Why weren't U.S. soldiers told the truth? Why were they kept in the dark about the real reasons for the war? The answer is simple. The truth would have destroyed the government's narrative. If soldiers had known the secret deals, the covert operations, and the true scale of devastation planned in Vietnam, many would have refused to fight. This is why, to this day, veterans speak of the betrayal they felt when they discovered, years later, that the war they risked their lives for had little to do with freedom and everything to do with power, money, and global influence. The Vietnam War was never just a war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. It was a proxy war, a battlefield where superpowers tested strategies, technologies, and psychological operations. The U.S. government used Vietnam as a testing ground, not only for weapons but also for propaganda campaigns, psychological warfare, and chemical experiments like Agent Orange that left scars for generations. And while soldiers were told they were defending democracy, many villages were bombed indiscriminately. Countless civilians were killed, and the U.S. military was caught in a cycle of destruction without a clear strategy for victory. For the average soldier, Vietnam was a nightmare. Tropical jungles, guerrilla warfare, and an enemy that blended with the local population. But what made it worse was the lack of truth. Soldiers were not told that the war was based on fabricated events like the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Powerful corporations stood to profit from weapons contracts and war supplies. That chemical warfare would not only devastate Vietnam, but would also permanently harm U.S. troops. That the government had no clear plan to win, only to prolong the conflict. In short, America's bravest were sent into a meat grinder of deception. When history classes explain the Vietnam War, they usually give a simple answer. America entered Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. On the surface, this explanation makes sense. The Cold War was raging, and the United States feared that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would follow like dominoes. This idea became known as the domino theory. America's involvement in Vietnam was not just about ideology or communism. It was about global power, economic interests, and political deception. Soldiers on the ground were never told these hidden motives. But today we're going to uncover them. The domino theory, a convenient excuse. The official story was that if Vietnam became communist, neighboring countries like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and even Indonesia would fall. But here's the truth. The domino theory was not based on fact. It was a political tool, a slogan designed to justify war to the American people. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials knew that Southeast Asia wasn't just about communism. It was about resources, influence, and control of global trade routes. Vietnam's location made it strategically valuable, a gateway to the South China Sea. Whoever controlled Vietnam had a foothold in Asia, protecting corporate interests. One of the least talked about aspects of the Vietnam War is the role of corporations and economic interests. The war created billions of dollars in contracts for defense companies like Boeing, Lockheed, and General Electric. Every bomb dropped, every helicopter built, every bullet fired meant profit for these corporations. For the military-industrial complex, Vietnam was a golden opportunity. The longer the war lasted, the more money flowed into weapons production, oil supply contracts, and construction projects. Soldiers thought they were fighting for freedom, but behind the scenes, war profiteers were cashing in. The Gulf of Tonkin deception. Perhaps the most shocking hidden motive is tied to the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. The American public was told that North Vietnamese forces had attacked U.S. ships in international waters. This attack gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the excuse he needed to escalate the war. But decades later, documents revealed the truth. The Gulf of Tonkin attack was exaggerated, and in one case, completely fabricated. U.S. soldiers were sent to die in Vietnam because of a staged incident, carefully manipulated to gain public support for war. This was not about defense. It was about manipulating public opinion to justify an agenda. Geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union and China. Vietnam also became a chessboard in the Cold War. The U.S. government feared that if it lost Vietnam, it would show weakness against the Soviet Union and China. For American leaders, saving face on the world stage mattered more than saving soldiers' lives. To Washington, Vietnam wasn't just a jungle war. It was a global message. America will fight anywhere, anytime, to protect its image of strength. Unfortunately, this pride cost millions of lives. Political survival at home. There was also a domestic motive. Presidents like Lyndon B. Johnson feared that if they lost Vietnam, they would be blamed politically. Johnson once admitted privately that he knew the war was unwinnable, but he escalated it anyway because he didn't want to be the president who lost Southeast Asia. Imagine that tens of thousands of young American soldiers were sacrificed because leaders feared political embarrassment, the hidden hands of the CIA. Another layer of hidden motives comes from the CIA. Vietnam was a battlefield not only for military operations, but also for secret, covert actions. The CIA used the war as cover for drug trafficking in the Golden Triangle, psychological experiments, and secret assassinations. Most soldiers had no idea that while they fought in the jungles, intelligence agencies were running shadow operations for power, money, and control. What soldiers were told versus the truth. What soldiers were told: you are defending freedom and democracy. The truth: they were fighting in a war engineered by deception, driven by profit, and prolonged for politics. The cruelest part is that soldiers were never told these motives. They went to Vietnam believing in honor and patriotism, only to return broken, and later learn that much of what they sacrificed for was based on lies. The hidden motives of the Vietnam War are more than just history. They're a warning for today. Whenever a government calls for war, citizens must ask, is this really about defense, or is there a hidden agenda? Because in Vietnam, the truth was buried beneath propaganda, and those who paid the highest price were the soldiers on the front lines, and the innocent civilians caught in the middle. When young American men were drafted or volunteered for the Vietnam War, they carried with them a sense of duty and pride. Recruiters, politicians, and the media filled their heads with powerful promises. They were told they would be heroes, that they would be welcomed by the Vietnamese people, and that their mission was clear, righteous, and necessary. But almost everything they were told before stepping onto the battlefield was a lie. These lies were carefully crafted to keep morale high, to justify a war that had no true purpose, and to manipulate an entire generation of young men into fighting a conflict designed in secrecy. The soldiers were told, the war will be short. America will win easily because we are the most powerful military in the world. When soldiers were shipped off to Vietnam, they were promised a swift victory. Recruiters claimed that the North Vietnamese were poorly trained, weak, and would quickly surrender against the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. military. The truth: the war dragged on for nearly 2 decades, 1955 to 1975, becoming one of the longest wars in U.S. history. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were far from weak. They were highly motivated, deeply committed, and experts in guerrilla warfare. U.S. soldiers were sent into a fight that had no end in sight. The soldiers were told, "You're fighting to defend freedom and democracy in Vietnam." This was the most powerful lie of all, a moral justification for killing and dying. Soldiers were convinced that they were saving innocent people from the evil of communism. The truth: South Vietnam, the side America supported, was run by corrupt leaders, brutal regimes, and dictators backed by U.S. money. Ordinary Vietnamese civilians often feared U.S.-backed forces as much as they feared the communists. Many U.S. soldiers were shocked to discover that the people they thought they were protecting viewed them as occupiers, not saviors. The soldiers were told, "The Vietnamese people will welcome you as heroes and liberators." Propaganda films and government speeches painted a picture of smiling Vietnamese villagers waving American flags. Soldiers were told they would be greeted with gratitude. The truth, many Vietnamese civilians saw American troops as invaders who bombed their villages, destroyed their crops, and killed their families. Instead of gratitude, soldiers were often met with fear, resentment, and even hatred. This left many young men confused, broken, and questioning the very reason for their presence in Vietnam. The soldiers were told, "The U.S. government will take care of you. You'll have the best equipment, the best training, and the full support of your country." The truth, many soldiers arrived in Vietnam with inadequate equipment, malfunctioning weapons like the early M16 rifle, and little understanding of the jungle terrain. The conditions were brutal. Diseases like malaria and trench foot killed more soldiers than combat in some areas. And when these men returned home, they did not find a grateful nation. Instead, many veterans were met with hostility, protests, and were often called baby killers. The government that promised to support them abandoned them, leaving countless veterans homeless, addicted, or suffering from untreated PTSD. The soldiers were told, "You will return home as heroes, honored for your sacrifice." The truth, the Vietnam War became one of the most unpopular wars in American history. When soldiers returned, many were spit on, insulted, and rejected by the very society they believed they were protecting. Instead of honor, they faced shame. Instead of recognition, they faced silence and neglect. Before deployment, soldiers were told that America had been attacked by North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, giving the U.S. the moral high ground to go to war. The truth, decades later, declassified documents proved that at least one of the attacks never happened. Thousands of soldiers were sent to fight and die because of a fabricated incident. The lie of purpose. Perhaps the greatest lie of all was that soldiers had a clear mission. They were told they were fighting for victory, but when they got to Vietnam, orders were often contradictory. Win hearts and minds one day, then burn the village to save it the next. The mission was not clear. It was chaos. These lies didn't just send men into battle. They broke their spirits. Many soldiers returned home asking the same haunting questions. What was it all for? Why did my friends die? Why did I kill people who never threatened my country? The betrayal of trust scarred an entire generation. To this day, Vietnam veterans speak not just of the battles they fought in the jungle, but of the lies they were told before they even picked up a rifle. The lies told to soldiers before deployment in Vietnam remind us of a chilling truth. Governments can manipulate reality to send ordinary people into wars they do not understand. It's a warning to future generations. Always question the narrative before stepping into battle. Because in Vietnam, the greatest weapon wasn't the rifle or the bomb, it was the lie. The Vietnam War was not just a battlefield of rifles, helicopters, and jungle combat. Behind the scenes, far away from the eyes of the public, and even the soldiers fighting on the ground, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, was conducting a war of its own. This was a shadow war filled with deception, assassination, drug trafficking, and secret experiments. While U.S. soldiers were told they were fighting for freedom, the CIA was executing missions that had little to do with defending democracy and everything to do with control, influence, and hidden agendas. One of the CIA's most infamous covert operations in Vietnam was the Phoenix program. Officially, it was described as an intelligence operation to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure. In reality, it became a campaign of assassination, torture, and terror. Thousands of Vietnamese civilians were arrested, tortured, or killed without trial. Villagers were accused of being Viet Cong sympathizers based on shaky intelligence. Entire communities were paralyzed with fear. What makes this chilling is that many U.S. soldiers didn't even know the Phoenix program existed. They fought in the open war, while the CIA fought in the shadows, often making enemies of the very people soldiers were told to win over. Perhaps one of the darkest secrets of the CIA in Vietnam was its involvement in the drug trade. The region known as the Golden Triangle, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, became a hub for opium and heroin production. Investigations later revealed that the CIA used drug profits to finance covert operations. Planes that flew weapons into Vietnam sometimes returned loaded with opium and heroin. These drugs found their way not only into Asian markets, but also back to America, fueling addiction at home. Soldiers on the ground often became addicted to cheap heroin available in Vietnam, not knowing that the same agency funding the war may have had a hand in spreading it. The Vietnam War didn't just happen in Vietnam. In secret, the CIA expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia, without telling the American public or even Congress. In Laos, the CIA recruited entire armies of Hmong tribesmen to fight against communist forces. This became known as the Secret War. In Cambodia, U.S. forces bombed vast areas in operations kept hidden from the American people. Tens of thousands of civilians died in these secret wars, which officially didn't exist. For U.S. soldiers, this meant they were fighting an enemy that seemed endless, not knowing that the war had spread into entire neighboring countries. The CIA also used Vietnam as a laboratory for psychological warfare. Villages were bombed with propaganda leaflets. Loudspeakers blasted terrifying sounds in the jungle at night to break enemy morale. Covert psychological operations, known as PSYOPs, were carried out to manipulate both the enemy and local populations. Even darker are the allegations that elements of the CIA experimented with drugs like LSD on soldiers and prisoners as part of mind control projects, echoing the notorious MK-Ultra program. While the CIA was running secret missions in Vietnam, it was also running an illegal program called Operation Chaos, spying on American citizens who opposed the war. Protesters, journalists, and even veterans were targeted as threats. This means that while soldiers were fighting overseas, the very government they served was secretly spying on their families and fellow citizens at home. What made these CIA operations especially devastating was that ordinary U.S. soldiers had no idea. They were told one story while another war raged behind the curtains. Many of the brutal tactics used by the CIA, assassinations, secret bombings, drug trafficking, directly undermined the mission soldiers thought they were fighting for. Imagine being told you're defending democracy, only to later discover your own government was engaged in assassination campaigns and illegal wars in countries the public never even knew were part of the conflict. The CIA's covert operations in Vietnam are a stark reminder of how wars can have two faces: the public war, shown on television and in newspapers, and the secret war, hidden in classified documents and covert missions. The Vietnam War was not just a tragedy of soldiers and civilians. It was also a tragedy of secrecy, where the truth was buried so deep that even those risking their lives on the front lines were left in the dark. This is why these secrets must be told, because every hidden mission, every covert operation, and every shadow war carried out by the CIA added to the suffering of millions, while the truth was carefully hidden from the American people. The Vietnam War wasn't only fought with bullets, bombs, and jungle ambushes. It was also fought in the minds of soldiers, civilians, and the global public. Behind every mission was a strategy of psychological warfare and propaganda designed to control perception, manipulate emotions, and rewrite the truth. This wasn't just war. This was mind control on a national scale. Before soldiers even set foot in Vietnam, the U.S. government launched one of the largest propaganda campaigns in its history. Hollywood films portrayed communism as pure evil. News outlets repeated government talking points without question. School children were taught that the war was about defending freedom. The truth was hidden behind patriotic slogans like "Support our troops" and "Fight for democracy." But what soldiers and the public never knew was that these slogans were carefully designed propaganda tools to silence questions and create blind loyalty. On the battlefield, psychological warfare was just as intense. Planes dropped millions of propaganda leaflets over villages, promising safety if civilians supported the U.S. loudspeakers. In the jungle broadcast eerie sounds of ghost voices to terrify Viet Cong fighters. Villages that resisted U.S. control were punished, sending a psychological message to others: comply or suffer. Soldiers were told they were winning hearts and minds, But in reality, many civilians only grew more resentful and resistant. The U.S. military also used psychological tactics on its own troops. Soldiers were told victories were around the corner, even as casualties piled up. Body counts were inflated to create the illusion of success. False narratives about progress were fed to keep morale from collapsing. But deep down, many soldiers sensed the truth. They were being lied to. The constant contradiction between what they were told and what they experienced created deep psychological scars. The Vietnam War was the first televised war. For the first time, millions of Americans saw the brutality of combat on their TV screens. The government tried to control this narrative, showing images of heroism while hiding the massacres, bombings, and devastation. But as independent journalists revealed the truth, from the My Lai massacre to the bombing of civilians, the propaganda machine began to crumble. The American public realized they had been deceived. The psychological tactics used in Vietnam didn't end with the war. They became a blueprint for future conflicts. Governments learned how to control media narratives to hide the truth. Use psychological operations not only on enemies, but also on their own people. The Vietnam War was more than a battlefield tragedy. It was proof that the greatest weapon of all is the human mind. The Vietnam War was not just about communism, democracy, or even military strategy. It was about lies, deception, and manipulation. Soldiers were sent to fight for a cause that was never real. Civilians were trapped between propaganda and destruction. A generation was scarred not just by war, but by the betrayal of truth. And today, these lessons still matter. Because every time a government pushes for war, the first casualty is always the truth. If this truth about the Vietnam War shook you, don't just watch. Be part of the movement to expose hidden history. Like this video right now so more people can break free from the lies. Comment your thoughts below. Which secret shocked you the most? The CIA's covert missions, the Gulf of Tonkin deception, or the betrayal of U.S. soldiers? Subscribe to Unrecorded Histories and hit the bell, because the next video will reveal secrets even more explosive than Vietnam. You won't want to miss it. Share this video with friends, family, and history lovers, because the truth only survives when we spread it. Wars may end, but hidden truths never die, unless we let them.